Hello again. Those hoping to portray Britain as having similar attitudes to race as were found in the American Deep South shortly after the end of the American Civil War are working at a great disadvantage because by all objective measures there is less racial prejudice in this country than there ever has been before. There have in the past been racist attacks, it's true, for example Stephen Lawrence almost 30 years ago, but nothing of the sort happens in the country these days from one decade to another. If the illusion of a country in the grip of systemic racism is to be maintained, it is therefore necessary to invent deaths resulting from racial tension. If done with enough ingenuity, such deceptions can be quite convincing. When news of the death of George Floyd in the United States precipitated widespread disorder in Britain, it was felt that protests would be more effective if a fatal victim of British racism could somehow be produced. Fortunately, there was an obvious candidate. On April the 5th, a little over a month before George Floyd's death, a female worker at a British railway station in London called Belly Mujinga died in hospital. I hope that I'm pronouncing the name correctly because I'm not at all proficient in Lingala, which is a dialect spoken in the Congo. This woman began to be described as the British face of Black Lives Matter, and protest marches were held and her name was widely publicised. The thumbnail to this video shows one such demonstration. As it was related in the newspapers, at least at first, the case seemed pretty awful and sounded as though there might indeed have been a racial element. Soon after the schools were closed down in late spring and everybody stopped travelling by tube and so on, two women from the Congo, employed by Govia Thameslink Railway, were selling tickets on the concourse at Victoria Station. Belly Mujinga and Motolani Sunmol were working together with a man who was also employed at the station. The suggestion later made was that a male customer had suddenly approached the three of them and spoken angrily, claiming to have COVID before spitting in Mujinga's face. This was on March 21st. She then became ill with COVID and died in hospital a couple of weeks later. If true, this was a dreadful business and Black Lives Matter sympathisers made a great deal of it and tried to hold the dead woman up as a martyr to British racism. Of course, if this was all true, then the man involved was plainly guilty of an assault, whether or not he had COVID at the time. Spitting in someone's face like that is an assault. I mean, it doesn't matter how ill you are or how healthy. If only he could be found, it was obvious that charges would soon follow. As soon as the police announced that they were looking for him, though, he came forward at once and gave quite a different version of events. So too did the male employee of the railway company. The result was that the police did not press charges or even caution the man. As far as they were concerned, after speaking to all the witnesses and viewing CCTV footage, no crime had been committed. He did not have COVID and said that although he had coughed, he certainly had not spat at anybody. The police, then passed all the details to the Crown Prosecution Service, who agreed that there was no case at all. Upon which the cries of racism and no justice for black people were predictably raised. Belly Mujinga's name became almost as well known in this country as George Floyd's was in America. At a march in London in June, the crowd chanted, "Black Lives Matter, Belly's life mattered." In September this year, a couple of months ago, the inquest into this woman's death was adjourned so that her husband could try and find an expert who would confirm that she had caught COVID at work at Victoria Station. Anybody care to guess why proving that Belly Mujinga caught the disease which killed her while at work is such a big deal? Now for the background to what had happened. 2 months before the incident, Belly Mujinga had started a grievance procedure against her employers, alleging, of course, discrimination and victimisation. When the incident on March 21st was first reported to their supervisors, neither of the two women said anything about spitting. Instead, they claimed that somebody had coughed near them or over them, and that they did not feel safe working on the concourse because of the risk of infection. Motolani Sunmole did not say anything about deliberate spitting later. Instead, what she said was, he was coughing and spitting like an old man who has no teeth. The man in question was 57 and apparently does have a cough. I can sympathise. I do sometimes cough and spit like an old man who has no teeth myself. But there's no racial elements to this behaviour. So it seems, the same was in this case. In fact, all the stuff about racism and somebody deliberately spitting in the dead woman's face only emerged a month after her death, when the union took up the case, encouraged by Motolani Sunmole and Belly Mujinga's husband. Often at the back of so many situations, whether we're talking about large-scale wars or minor industrial disputes, the essential motive at work is money, and there is at least a suspicion that that is just the case here. I say that because Motolani Sunmole has walked out of her job, claiming constructive dismissal. Her grounds are that she was not in a safe working environment, and if it can be proved that Belly Mujinga contracted COVID at work, then this will massively boost Sunmole's case and perhaps land some compensation. This is also probably at the back of the inquest being adjourned so that an expert can be found who will confirm that the disease was contracted at Victoria Station and nowhere else. This too could be the basis for compensation. One thing is absolutely certain, and that is that nobody deliberately spat at Belly Mujinga, and that the person about whom this allegation was made did not have COVID anyway at the time. The fact that the male worker who was present during the alleged incident does not back up the idea of a deliberate attack is interesting as well. Believe me, if the police had the slightest evidence that this was a malicious act, they would have been down on the supposed perpetrator like the proverbial ton of bricks. Behind many of the supposed instances of racism in Britain are similar stories like this one. Whenever you examine closely something which shows how terrible Britain is when it comes to race relations, you will very often find that you're being led up the garden path.